reform movements of the early 19th century. And just by the way, I think we already know this, or you have figured it out by now. So whenever we're talking, we name a century, like the 19th century, you're talking about the 1800s. Okay? We are currently in the 21st century, which means we're in the 2000s. Okay? So, and that, so you'll see this type of wording a lot, and we need to be able to keep that straight. Particularly if it's on a test and they're asking you about the 18th century, then you know that's the 1700s. Okay, let's go. This really isn't a reform, well, kind of. We're going to talk a little bit about religion, because we do have a second great awakening, and we do have some new religious groups that are going to spring up as a result of the second great awakening and other things that are happening. So just to remind us about the first great awakening, it's pre-American Revolution. And it was a lot about, I think yesterday in our vocab quiz, I heard turn or burn, right? Fire and brimstone. It was a very emotional sort of plea to people to hurry up and get right with Jesus. A lot of it was anti-predestination. You need to develop an individual relationship with God. So that's the first one. The second one compares like this. There is a re-emphasis on religious matters in daily life and also individualism, but we are looking at this because these religious awakenings, particularly the second great awakening, is what's going to kind of spark a lot of these reform movements. A lot of these reform movements kind of have a moral basis to them. People are trying to make society a better place for people to live. Okay, like prison reform and abolition. Even education, because you better be able to read the Bible. So that is a hallmark of the second great awakening. We see a lot of these reform movements. So people within the second great awakening, they are seeking salvation and trying to improve society. They were outdoor type revival meetings. They called them camp meetings back in the day, because it was just easier to hold more people if you just stage it outside. If you have to point to a guy and say he was one of the big people in the second great awakening, it would be this dude, Charles Finney. And he was out of Western New York, and Western New York got a nickname. It was called the Burnt Out District. And it was the Burnt Out District because Charles Finney and a lot of these other Great Awakening preachers they're preaching this in the same style that Whitefield and Edwards preached in, the hellfire and brimstone and turn or burn sort of thing. Again, this is focused on the power of the individual. The preaching is preaching individualism. You, as an individual, need to get right with Jesus. You need to accept Christ into your life and commit your life to Him. You don't necessarily need to go through an organized church. It's up to you. And this kind of coincides with this individualism that we are seeing in the country, the power of the individual as in the expansion of voting rights, and then women in the women's rights movement. And there was a lot of different types of preaching, and that leads to new churches kind of springing up around the place. And we'll talk about a handful of them. So yeah, this will be a picture of what you would expect to see at one of the camp meetings. Usually a stage was kind of built in a day or two, just, a basic plywood stage, and people would literally camp there for 3 or 4 days and hear preaching and music throughout the time. All right, so the burnt out district in New York City, of course, is down here, and this is the burnt out district of New York, where the Great Awakening is kind of headquartered. Now, somebody that came out of the burnt out district, specifically Palmyra, New York, which is in the burnt out district, was John Smith, who created the Mormon Church. That's kind of the common name for them. The proper name is Church of the Latter-day Saints, and Day Saints ought to be capitalized. My apologies. But yeah, the Mormons. This is a brand new religious denomination, and a Christian denomination. Joseph Smith, I think I called him John. Joseph Smith. Founder and leader of the Mormons is Joseph Smith. He is from the burnt out district in New York, and he says that he was directed by an angel. He got a vision one night where an angel appeared to him, and this angel directed him to this place outside his home, and he dug up golden tablets, which basically have the inscription of the Mormon faith on it. And that this angel delivered the ideals and all of that to him. So the Mormons said that they are modern day Christians. In fact, Joseph Smith will write the Book of Mormon, which is kind of like a third testament to the Bible, right? You got the Old Testament, the New Testament, in their traditional Christian Bible. The Book of Mormon would be Testament number 3. And some of the things that the Mormons did differently is that Joseph Smith said one of the things the angel told him is that husbands should have multiple wives. And so the Mormons started practicing polygamy. He was kicked, and because of this, his group was kicked out of New York, and then kicked out of Ohio, and then kicked out of Illinois, and this is wherever, and this, I think Joseph Smith was murdered in Illinois. The Mormons were just way too different for established people that were established in that area in their traditional Christian beliefs to accept. And it wasn't just the polygamy. It was, no, God told me about this whole other book of the Bible that he calls the Book of Mormon. And you need to listen to me so I can tell you about it. He claimed to be a modern day prophet. And traditional Christians were like, not having that. And him and several of the other early Mormon leaders are going to be ran out of town and some murdered. The guy that takes over the Mormon church after Joseph Smith is murdered is going to be Brigham Young, as in Brigham Young University, BYU, which is in Salt Lake City, Utah. And that is where Brigham Young took the Mormons. It was way out, of course, in Utah, and technically that wasn't even American territory, 100%, whenever they settled it. And there's a reason they went all the way out to Utah. First, Brigham Young said, you know, this is where God's telling me to go, but it was to escape the Americans that didn't like them. And the Mormon church and the Mormon community grew and prospered, and Salt Lake City is still like the headquarters of the church. Lots of Mormons in Utah. And Utah is not going to be allowed to join the U.S. once the United States does get ownership of all of that territory in the West. They're not going to be allowed to join the United States till 1896 because we're just so of the Mormons. Particularly the polygamy thing, but it was also that, you know, it's not just marrying multiple women. It was also in the early church, you know, the church leaders would, you know, marry 12-year-old girls. And that's, I think we can all agree that that is not the way things ought to go. All right, so the Mormons. All right, other religious groups that kind of spring up. And a lot of these religious groups are trying to form utopian societies. They're trying to create a perfect society on earth where everybody gets along and everybody shares and everybody's happy, and it's, you know, that never works. So one of the utopian communities is called New Harmony. It is started by Robert Owen. It is in Indiana, and they are trying to form a socialist society. Robert Owen is going to be a capitalist. He had some factories back east, but he decided to start this settlement in New Harmony, Indiana, as a utopian society where all of the workers they all share ownership of the production in the factory, so it's almost like the communist ideal, where the workers own the means of production and everything is shared in society. There is no boss. It is just all a community of workers. And it will fail after a few years. The Oneida community in New York, and again, this is Western New York, in that burnt out district. It is one of the longest lasting of these utopian communities because they were actually very financially successful. And if you have money, you can, you know, stick around for a while. The Oneidas, they were known for, they called it complex marriage, which the idea that within the Oneida community, everybody was married to everybody. So they were just like a bunch of swingers. Just, you know, everybody just married and having relations with everybody. My favorite of the groups are the Shakers because they were founded just outside of Lexington, Kentucky. And the Shakers were, they were not necessarily, they did try to create a utopian society, but they were very hardcore religious people, okay? The New Harmony and Oneida, not necessarily hardcore religious people, but the Shakers, definitely hardcore religious people. And the Shakers don't last terribly long because they all died out because they prohibited marriage and sex. So no marriage, no sex, so no new little Shakers running around ever, right? They had to recruit people to become Shakers, and the no sex part wasn't appealing to everybody, right? But the Shakers did establish a community. They were around for about 20, 25 years. And there's actually, it's like between Versailles and Lexington, there is a Shaker historical community where they like, there's a little Shaker, where the Shaker village used to be. You can go visit that and see how they lived, and they have historical interpreters and all of that. They were called Shakers. They got that nickname because whenever they were having a church service, and they had church every night, they would feel the spirit and just start dancing and shaking the building and just getting it. So yeah, they were the Shakers. This is the New Harmony. And you see that, you know, it looks nice. But it also looks a little bit like a prison. Yeah? And that's what an actual photograph of it looks like, kind of up close. And then this is your Shaker community outside of Lexington.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the slide real quick?
Yeah.
I did my poster over it, and then there's a couple more things. The Oneida, they believe Jesus came back in 70 AD. And then, of course, as with most societies, they did do a eugenics program.
Oh.
So only like specific people could have sex with each other, or at least to purposely have a baby.
Okay.
And then the Shakers would just like not adopt, but like people that didn't want to have babies and give them to the Shakers.
Okay.
So they got a couple.
A couple.
Okay.
Yeah, recruit them as the young. Well, thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. Yeah, I didn't know the whole eugenics part of the Oneidas.
Yeah, it was really funny because basically, Oneida serpiculture, it's basically they're only allowed to edge.
Okay.
Unless they're trying to have a baby.
There you
So,
go. That's
weird
it's
stuff.
weird stuff. Interesting research though, yeah. All right. So some of the other like genuine reform movements, we'll get out religion for now. We're going to start with temperance. The temperance movement, temperance is another word for, cutting back, right? So sometimes when we talk about the temperance movement, we're talking about limiting alcohol, but we also talk about prohibition, which wants to absolutely outlaw alcohol. And a lot of times, these are interchangeable, okay? So the temperance movement, the prohibition movement is kind of the same thing. Temperance is moderation, and then prohibition is you're just not going to do it at all. Abstinence. You don't drink, period. Now, temperance and women's rights go together hand in hand here because they share several of the same goals. The temperance movement is really organized by women. Some of your leaders in the movement are women, and they are saying that alcoholic men are the #1 cause of domestic violence, domestic abuse, and hardships within the family. So they say that if we outlaw alcohol, that will help the family and keep women and children from getting beat up. So one of the big goals of the temperance movement, of course, is to limit alcohol, and they're hoping that will lead to a decrease in domestic violence. We're going to look at, I think I have each of these kind of blown up, but this is some of the propaganda that you would have seen for the temperance movement. This is called the Drunkard's Progress. And so it just starts with, a little drink here and there. No big deal. But then the next step is you're hanging out at the bar all the time, throwing up, passing out, getting into fights, spending the money that should be buying groceries and shoes for the kids. And then you don't just get drunk at the bar, you come home totally wasted and you're wreaking havoc at the house and beating up the mother and the child. And then eventually the family loses everything. So that's the drunkard's progress, and that is what the temperance movement is trying to stop. Here's another look, but it's the same sort of thing. Innocent little social drinks, and then, maybe you start getting violent. Then you're getting drunk and hanging out with your friend, and then you end with shooting yourself in the head. Yes?
On the previous, did you go back one more?
Mm-hmm.
Like the Bible verse up there, Proverbs 23, the wages of sin is death. Is that like what was on the?
Mm-hmm. It was like the caption of the,
okay.
yeah, of the picture. Yep. So, yeah, it's really strong here. Now, there was some progress in the temperance movement. The state of Massachusetts will pass a law called the 15-Gallon Act, and that meant you could only buy spirits, whether it's beer or liquor, in containers that were 15 gallons or larger. And y'all can picture a gallon of milk, right? So 15 gallons is like a barrel, yeah? So the purpose of the 15-Gallon Act is you can't go to the local bar and get like a glass of beer, right? Or a shot of whiskey. And poor people cannot afford a 15-gallon drum of anything, yeah? So the 15-Gallon Act, it outlawed the sale of basically single-serve alcohol. And that it shut down the bars, and it kept poor people, working class people, from buying alcohol. Now, if you were wealthy enough, you can buy a 15-gallon keg of whiskey and have a party at, and with your friends or whatever. But, so the elite, the rich folks, could still buy their liquor, but it shut down the bars. Working class, poor class cannot. Writers got into the temperance movement as well, writing fiction about, the awfulness of alcohol. We also see temperance in the schools. This is a little snippet from a reading book that you might read in school. Drunkenness is a vice which is remarkably ensnaring and deceitful. No habit is more difficult to break off than the habit of intemperance. It's always better to prevent evils than to cure them. The sober, the respectable, the virtuous. They're the non-drinkers. So, teaching kids in school. And of course, this is an illustration, and nobody wants this. All right, one of my favorite people in all of American history is this gal, Carrie Nation. She is head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She is from Kentucky, and she is built like an NFL linebacker. She was about 6'3" and 215 pounds. And she wore like a gun holster, but she didn't carry guns. She carried hatchets
Yes.
in her belt.
She's amazing.
Yes.
I want to be her.
That was what she did. She would literally, her and her people would go into bars, go into saloons, and bust the place up with their hatchets.
That sounds like my type yeah.
And she would bust into the bar and yell, "Smash, lady, smash!" And they would just go to town. Crazy.
First female.
She worked and did her smashing from Boston all the way out to the Kansas territory. Yeah, she traveled the country preaching temperance and smashing up bars. This is one of my favorite quotes of her. This is how she described herself. She said she is like a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like. And of course, Jesus doesn't like you getting drunk. So she's going to bark at you. Yeah.
Were women allowed in bars back then?
Yes, but a respectable woman would not be caught there, right? Unless you're there to smash it up. A lot of times there were like, nowadays we would call it like a to-go window. Like if you were going to send somebody to, that way a female wouldn't have to go into the bar to go, yell at the husband. They would just go to the little takeout window and, would you please send Jason home? All right, so this is a political cartoon that was in I forgot what, it's one of the New York papers. And this is after she busted up a saloon in New York City. The temperance prohibition people do eventually end. They do get what they want. It takes a while, but in 1919, we add the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and that brings about prohibition. You cannot buy, sell, or transport alcohol in the United States. However, it doesn't last long. You can see prohibition was 14 years or so. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment.
Didn't they still smuggle?
Yes.
Oh,
They
yes.
highly smell.
Yes, and that was one of the reasons for the,
Was it
bringing it back, because there was so much disrespect for the law and organized crime really
Yeah.
became more
Yeah, because
violent.
like mobs and
Yeah.
mafia.
Yeah, like Al Capone, we probably all heard of Al Capone before. He was just a minor thug before Prohibition, but then he really became super thug and super wealthy as a beer and liquor runner. So here's a couple of our posters here, Ayla and Isaiah. Excellent work.
Wait,
Or did I get them backwards?
that's not mine.
This isn't you?
Nope.
Really?
Yes, that's not mine.
This isn't you?
I had one similar to it, but I ended up changing it completely.
Oh, okay. You might want to resend it to me
Okay.
then.
Okay.
Okay, Isaiah, is this you?
Yeah.
Excellent. Vote against the sale of liquor. I like this. Good job. All right, so the abolition movement. The abolition movement, number 2. How are we doing with time here?
Austin Blessingham, come to the office, please. Austin Blessingham, come to the office, please.
Okay. All right, so abolition. Abolition means to get rid of slavery. Talk about the abolition of slavery. All right, so let's look at this map real quick. Notice the date, 1820. 1820. The slave population. One dot equals 200 slaves. And one dot is like this dot right here. So if, you know, it is totally orange, obviously that is a lot of dots. This is the Chesapeake region, you know, the original Jamestown, and where we first originally brought Africans into what's now the United States. Cluster here in Kentucky. And this is 1820. And we're going to jump ahead to the eve of the Civil War, 1860. And you can see in Virginia the expansion. This was already kind of like this, but now you have what is known as the Black Belt. You can see that developing through the South. And black is, it's not referencing the color of people. It is talking about the fertile black soil of that region. And it goes right through these 3 states. And so there you go. And also, of course, Western Kentucky. You can see up here where we are. So, yeah, so we have a tremendous expansion of slavery, and this is just in 40 years.
Would you happen to have a random explanation for why, like, in the first one, the
Yeah.
bunch that's in Kentucky just disperses?
Just disappears. I do not have a good explanation. Because you don't see kind of that, a cluster disappear anyplace else, right? All you see is the expansion, really, I think. That's interesting. It has to be, obviously, it has to be the use of the land.
One kind of disappears in South Carolina.
Yeah.
It could be as the rise of.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. It was here. Go ahead, what were you gonna say?
Well, like, Kentucky became dense enough that there wasn't, like, there used to be a bunch of farms there, but it became dense enough that the farms kind of moved to.
Right,
Other
that moved
parts of
out
Kentucky.
to
Like it
Western
became a bigger
Kentucky.
city.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good explanation. And maybe depending on what was being grown there, maybe the soil got ran out, so, you know, I said ran out, the soil got worn out, and they had
I
to
feel like there
move.
could be
I
a
don't
lot
know.
of different types of explanations.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll see if I can find something out about that. That's interesting. Okay, let's talk about this group here. American Colonization Society. American Colonization Society, 1817. The American Colonization Society had something for everyone here. Yeah, something for everyone. It did advocate for the abolition of slavery.
Austin Blessingham, come to the office, please. Austin Blessingham, come to the office, please.
And that black people ought to immigrate to Africa. That's the big idea. That enslaved people ought to be released from slavery and sent to Africa, and free black people ought to willingly immigrate to Africa. And when this first started, there were about 1,400 black Americans that did this. And the American Colonization Society actually bought the freedom of several hundred enslaved people and then moved them to Africa, particularly a country called Liberia, which is on the west coast of Africa. And get it, Liberia as in liberty, yeah? And by the way, the capital of Liberia was named after the president at the time. It was, the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, after President Monroe, who was a member of the American slavery, but they're not all about people being equal, right? By this point, by the early 1800s, most people in the northern United States think slavery is bad. And we ought to get rid of it. But most of those same people do not think black people and white people are equal and can coexist. So, they think this is a good idea by just pretty much deporting black people. Southerners support this as well because they think that, well, if all free black people in the United States are pretty much deported or voluntarily go to Liberia, then that actually helps them as enslavers because runaway slaves cannot ever blend in with a free black population. So it would, they thought, cut down on the instance of their enslaved people trying to escape. So the American Colonization Society. This is going to be around all the way up through the Civil War. And wealthy people, particularly in the North, will donate a lot of money, and you do see them purchasing the freedom of enslaved people to have them voluntarily move to Liberia. Just like there was a reader for temperance, abolitionists put together education books as well. This is to help kids learn their ABCs. A is for abolitionist, who wants to free the wretched slave and to give to all an equal liberty. B is for brother. B is a brother with a skin a somewhat darker hue, but in our Heavenly Father's sight, he is as dear as you. So, and then of course there's the other stuff too. K is the kidnapper who stole that little child and mother. Shrieking, it clung around her, but it tore from each other. David Walker. He is going to write this, a preamble to the colored citizens of the world, and it is basically a abolitionist manifesto. We're going to take a look at a video with a couple of these people in it. These are the Grimke sisters. They actually grew up in a South Carolina slave-owning family, but decided that, this ain't right. They're going to move to Pennsylvania, they're going to become Quakers, they're going to become abolitionists. And they're two of the first female leaders in the abolitionist movement. In the video, we're also going to take a look at this guy, Frederick Douglass, who is probably one of the best known abolitionists. He is a runaway slave who was self-educated, and he becomes the voice for abolition. So I think this is the link to the video I want to watch. Let's see if this works. Bet you I'm on late. All right. Yep.
As the daughter of one of South Carolina's first families, Angelina Grimke lived in almost unimaginable luxury. In the 1820s, Charleston's aristocracy was one of the wealthiest societies on earth. But Angelina found it almost unbearable. An empire of sin.
got it from his slave and gave it to you. There was nothing that you had to do, that there wasn't a slave who took care of it for you.
Did you hear last night?
Hear what?
Really?
Angelina, what are you talking about?
Henry, he whipped John again.
I told you before, dear, that's Henry's business. Angelina attacked slavery, not in the beginning because she cared about the slaves.
Business.
She was really concerned about the fate of their white masters.
So leave him alone. He's my brother.
Yes, I know. She believed slavery was a sin and that God would punish people who had slaves.
Mother, it is my duty to bear testimony.
Angelina, mind your own business.
It is my business, and it's your business too. How can you stand in church every week? I can't let it be. Have you no Christian feelings?
Yes, Angelina, I have Christian feelings, and you are putting them to the test right now. My soul will be judged by the Lord, and not by you or anyone else.
It is my duty.
It is not your duty, Angelina. I'm glad, I suppose, that you are so diligent about your faith. But leave my soul to me, and Henry's to Henry.
I speak the truth in love.
Enough.
Mother. Mother, listen to me. Mother.
Angelina's religious search was tortured. She was more or less on her own as she struggled with very deep and troubling issues about herself and her relationship to God.
In the fall of 1829, Grimke resolved to leave Charleston and the pollutions of slavery for an uncertain future in the North.
There's a kind of fearlessness about Angelina Grimke. Women did not strike out. White women did not strike out on their own in this way, and Southern white women certainly did not. This is disobedience to proper society, to the South, to the church.
Frederick Douglass was alone in a terrifying new world. A few weeks earlier, the 6-year-old had been delivered to his master's home on Maryland's eastern shore to begin his life as a slave. His first experience of slavery would haunt him to his grave.
Aunt Hester went out one night and happened to be absent when the master desired her presence.
once seemed likely that it would disappear in the South as well, but no more. The invention of the cotton gin had led to a massive increase in cotton production, making slavery indispensable to both the South and the North.
It's actually quite astounding how deeply entrenched it was in the nation's political and economic life. What is seen as this sort of idiosyncratic, peculiar Southern institution actually had an enormous economic significance in the national economy of the United States.
Slaves were the single largest financial asset in the entire American economy, worth more than all manufacturing, all railroad, steamship lines, and other transportation systems put together. The only thing in the American economy worth more as simply a financial asset was the land itself, and no one really quite knows how to value, North America. The only voices advocating the abolition of slavery were black. Their frustration was growing, and some of them were becoming more militant. But no one in power was listening. As of yet, no white Americans could imagine turning millions of dollars worth of slaves into millions of black compatriots. But scattered around the country, a few lonely souls were convinced that slavery was a crime against God and man. And in Boston, one of them was coming to understand that God intended he do something about it. William Lloyd Garrison felt that he was destined to do great things, but he had no idea how to get there. In 1828, he was 22 years old, newly arrived in the city from his hometown of Newburyport. Garrison's father, a seaman and a drunk, had abandoned the family when Garrison was 2 years old. Plunged into poverty, Garrison's mother left her children for years on end as she looked for work. But in their time together, she managed to drum a fierce Christian conscience into her son.
William Lloyd Garrison's religious background was not just a background, it was at the core of who he was. It was an indwelling spirit inside of him that constantly thought about making God's will come into being on this earth.
Shortly after arriving in Boston, Garrison happened to meet an itinerant publisher who was raising money for his one-man anti-slavery newspaper. Garrison was horrified by descriptions of the slave pens where men, women, and children were held awaiting shipment further south. And he began to think that ending slavery was the cause that could give meaning to his life.
Alright, so here we are. So the Grimke sisters, Angelina, and then her sister Sarah will join her. And then Frederick Douglass. And the last guy here, William Lloyd Garrison. He will become the publisher of the abolitionist newspaper known as The Liberator. And he was one of the few white people, abolitionists or not, that said that we shouldn't just get rid of slavery. We need to think about equality. And he talked about setting the stage for equality throughout the United States between blacks and whites and everybody. Garrison and Douglass do become friends later on after Douglass does run away and become free, and they have disagreements from time to time, but they always remained pretty good friends and definitely on the same side of abolition. So, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is the kind of the big game changer in the United States as far as the abolition movement goes. This was a popular novel that that was anti-slavery. It talked about the horrors of slavery and how everybody ought to just be ashamed that this is happening in the United States. The author is Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it was quite literally the best-selling book in America for about 30 years, just behind the Bible. There were more Bibles sold, but then it was her book after that. We're gonna take a look at this real quick.
In the spring of 1833, 22-year-old Harriet Beecher Stowe crossed over the river into neighboring Kentucky. She had never before visited a slave state.
This is in Washington, Kentucky, along the Ohio River, and she was coming in from Ohio. And there's actually an Underground Railroad Museum in Washington, Kentucky, where they kind of tell this story as well. It's pretty interesting if you're ever up that way.
We have this fine specimen here. What do you get? 25? 50? We got 50 going once. 50 going twice. 50 sold to the gentleman here. How you gentlemen doing this nice warm Kentucky day? Let's keep this thing going.
What Stowe sees there is a human thing. She sees these people. I mean, they are human beings. She's confronted with it in such an intimate way. And I think that never leaves her.
Not long after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, a runaway knocked on the door of a house in Brunswick, Maine. As fate would have it, he had come upon the new home of Harriet Beecher Stowe and her family. Stowe was well aware of the punishment facing anyone who helped a runaway, but she was glad of the opportunity to defy the government. Before this law, I might have tried to send him somewhere else, she wrote her sister. As it was, all hands in the house united in making him up a bed. Like many Northerners, Stowe was deeply disturbed by the Fugitive Slave Law. For her, its cruelty was all too real.
My heart breaks at the cruelty and injustice our nation inflicts on the slave. I am tormented by the thought of the slave mothers whose babes are torn from them. I pray to God to let me do a little, and to cause my cry for them to be heard.
And it all came together in a vision. Instead of Christ on the cross, she saw an image of a slave being whipped. And she wrote the ending of Uncle Tom's Cabin when Uncle Tom dies. And when she read it to her family, they were all crying and they said, "Mommy, you've got to write the rest of the story."
On March 20th, 1852, a publisher released a book on a difficult subject by an unknown author. By the end of the week, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel about the evils of slavery had sold 10,000 copies. Within 2 months, 50,000. 3 paper mills feeding 3 printing presses running 24 hours a day, and still the publisher couldn't keep up. Soon, Uncle Tom's Cabin began reaching vast new audiences, including many who had never read a novel when it was adapted as a wildly popular play. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe made millions of Americans see slavery for the first time through the eyes of its victims. The mother whose child was to be sold away. The boy watching helplessly as his sister is whipped. Eliza fleeing with her baby across the Ohio River, only one step ahead of the slave catchers.
And it was said that when the novel was put on stage, there was not one dry eye when Eliza reached the other side of the river. And Harriet knew that if she could get that response from her readers, she didn't need to make arguments about slavery.
She realizes that the way to do this was by playing on the heartstrings. You don't do it by playing on the outrage. You do it by convincing them that there are human beings in peril. It is the most popular book and the most influential book in American history. There is no competition for that title. It's going to convert millions of Americans, not to being for immediate abolitionism, not to being for racial equality, but for being against slavery. Now that's a huge thing. That's a sea change.
You can see Stowe taking aim at the fugitive slave law in incident after incident, and basically urging her readers to defy what she thought was an anti-Christian, undemocratic law.
All right, so Uncle Tom's Cabin was the big game changer. The law that they kept referring to in the video, the fugitive slave law, it comes about in 1850 as part of a big compromise, and we'll get to that later. But basically, it made everybody required by law to turn in runaway slaves, or you could be imprisoned. So it was not nice. So the Underground Railroad, we've heard about the Underground Railroad before, I hope. It was not a real railroad, and it was not underground either. Underground just means secret, right? If you say something is underground, that means it is secret, you're not supposed to talk about it, that sort of thing. And railroad is just a way to transport people. So the Underground Railroad is a network of secret routes and safe houses to get enslaved people out of the South and into a free state. And then, particularly after that fugitive slave law is passed, the goal is Canada. Because black people were not safe in free states. Even people born as a free black person were not safe in free states after that fugitive slave law. And the person most associated with the Underground Railroad is Harriet Tubman. And she traveled from the north to the south and back and forth almost 100 times, rescuing people and carrying them along the way. And the Underground Railroad did go, like that the book suggests, Uncle Tom Cabin suggests, there was a lot of routes through Kentucky because Ohio was a very safe state for a long time until the fugitive slave law. So getting across the Ohio River into Ohio from Kentucky was one of the ends of the Underground Railroad. And particularly around Washington, Kentucky, certain times of the year, you can walk across the Ohio River. And that was the goal. Just some artwork here about the Underground Railroad, and what kind of time we got? Let's look at this next slide so we can show off the artwork of Sydney and JC. Very nice. Very nice. I saw a movie, I don't remember what streaming service it was on, but it ended with this famous photograph. It was, what was the name of it? It was about it was played by Will Smith. The enslaved person was played by Will Smith, and he had joined the Union Army during the Civil War, and he was wounded in battle, and when they had him in like the battlefield hospital, and they were, fixing him up and looking him over. One of the surgeons saw all the scars on his back from just repeatedly being beaten all the time as an enslaved person, and took that photograph. And of course, that's one of the most famous photographs of the outcome of slavery.
Is the movie called Emancipation?
Yes, it's called Emancipation. It's pretty good. It's, of course, violent. He runs away. He joins the army. But there are several things to it that are really good, like historically accurate. So, if you're looking for something to stream, where did you find it? Like, what service is it on?
I saw
I forgot.
TV.
Okay, yeah, I forgot
I
what
use
I
a
watched
legal
it.
website called Go Movies.
Okay. So very good, and I love this. Am I not a man? And that, of course, becomes a big motto of not just the anti-slavery movement, but throughout the civil rights movement as well. In fact, I got that little poster right there. I am a man, which was a sign carried during the civil rights movement. All right, we're going to call that good. I'll put the bell work up. We will finish this up on Monday and do some more things to prep for our
I forgot. I was like, why are we done so early?
Because I think this is already on Mondays, like next